Marcus Junius Brutus, Tribune 83 BCE. The father of the famed tyrannicide, Marcus Junius Brutus was the first man from his branch of the family to reach high office in generations. The elder Brutus rose to prominence in the 80s, one of the most chaotic decades in Roman history, bookended as it was by the social war and Sulla's prescriptions against the partisans of Marius and Cinna. Since our surviving sources focus so heavily on the many major events of the era, such as the First and Second Mithridatic Wars, and the men at the forefront of such events, we know far less about a number of major figures than we would like. Brutus is a prime example of a major politician whose actions are poorly understood because what precious little we know about his intentions comes from hostile accounts written many years later. The result is that we don't even know whether he sided with Sulla or Cinna and Carbo during the final phase of the Civil War of the 80s. Thus, we cannot say with any certainty if this Brutus's politics aligned with those of his far more famous son. All of that being said, we know more about Brutus's leading ally, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the consul of 78 and father of the future triumvir. Here I will try to highlight Brutus's role in the infamous revolt of Lepidus, and I will argue that he most likely stood with the Marian faction. Therefore, by extension, the lack of clarity about the elder Brutus's politics may have been a deliberate effort to beatify his son as a political purist driven only by honor, tradition, and virtue. In the process, I hope that we can gain some insight into the differences in the political climates of the age of Sulla and the age of Caesar, while also developing a stronger understanding of Lepidus's often misunderstood and obscure revolt. From the very moment of his birth, Marcus Junius Brutus was blessed with instant name recognition throughout Roman society. The Junii Brutii had a legendary place in Rome's history. In fact, the Romans did not clearly separate history and mythology, and it's unclear if the first Junius Brutus was in fact historical or how historical he actually was. Nonetheless, all Romans believed that he was one of the two major co-founders of the Republic. Lucius Junius Brutus, who was active right around 509 or so BCE, had first helped to avenge the rape of Lucretia. Lucretia was a Roman noblewoman who was raped by the heir apparent to the Roman throne at the time, and Brutus had raised a revolt to get rid of the prince and his father, the last king Tarquinius Superbus. They had then expelled the monarchy and had gone on to found the Republic, which was where the Senate, the advisory council to the king, took over as the new government. And Lucius Junius Brutus had been one of the two first consuls of the Roman Republic. The family's fortunes had fallen off, and it hadn't been prominent in a while. Even by the end of the early Republic, the Junii Brutii name had lost a lot of its luster, or at least its contemporary luster. But because of the retelling of the family's story, and the fact that the story of the tyrannicides led by Lucius Junius Brutus was something that every Roman would have drilled into them from early childhood, this meant that Marcus Junius Brutus and his son would have a lot of clout just by virtue of being members of the same family. So it looks like this Marcus Junius Brutus not only had the great name for politics, but his family's fortunes had revived. Like a number of other families who had kind of fallen off during the Middle Republic, as business opportunities emerged in the Late Republic, some of the families who had been out of the game suddenly found themselves back on top. So Marcus Junius Brutus is most likely the first member of his family in quite some time to achieve prominence, or at least a senior magistracy such as the praetorship. Brutus got married in the early 80s. In this case, that would mean 89 or 88 rather than, say, 81, because remember, years BCE move in reverse order. And the pair had a son, Marcus Junius Brutus, the famous tyrannicide, who was born around 85 or so BCE. For the sake of simplicity and clarity, I'm going to refer to the Brutus who is the subject of this video as Papa Brutus. As we'll see, there are a lot of guys named Brutus we need to talk about. One of the biggest issues when dealing with Papa Brutus is trying to figure out where he stood politically. And there are two major complications in that. One is that the politics of the 70s we now think are more complex than they are presented in the sources. And we know that lots of things changed between the age of Sulla and the age of Caesar. However, those things are not very clearly recorded. Most Roman authors were not interested in getting into political trends and trying to explain exactly how alliances worked. When they wrote, they assumed their audience were contemporaries and that they knew what was happening. And they also tended to engage in exaggerated rhetoric in order to make themselves look better and their opponents look worse. So partisanship played a big role in trying to obscure the landscape. Also, there's a lot of current scholarship really challenging consensus views of what the 70s were actually like in the Roman Republic. So we've got that problem going on. And at the same time, another problem that we have is that most of what people assume about Papa Brutus is based on the fact that his name is Marcus Junius Brutus, and his son had a very clear set of politics. At least he does in the tradition. He was kind of the dyed-in-the-wool optimate, the one true heir to Cato the Younger. Well, one thing to keep in mind is that it's very difficult to read back the politics of Brutus the tyrannicide into Papa Brutus. Brutus the tyrannicide grew up in a different world. He grew up in a world where things had fundamentally changed. And in fact, I'm going to argue that Papa Brutus was not a supporter of Sulla, as one might just assume based on the family name and the politics of the son. Here's one piece of information. Another Marcus Junius Brutus, who was almost certainly a cousin of some description, served as Praetor in 88, had fought for Marius and Cinna against Sulla, and had then committed suicide in 82, after Sulla's victory was all but assured. So he chose suicide over surrender, and Sulla wasn't really known for his mercy. He was not like Caesar, so perhaps this was a wise course of action. Nonetheless, perhaps that would set an example later for Papa Brutus's famous son. At any rate, this means that there's another Brutus who could very well be closely related and aligned with Papa Brutus, who was a Marian. Another thing that's a more important piece of information in my mind is that Brutus, Papa Brutus that is, served as Praetor in 83 BCE. This is before Sulla came home, so that he had to get this office from Carbo, who would have been the major power in Rome, and there's a good chance that the appointment was actually predetermined by Cinna before his death in late 84. This means that he must have been loyal to the more populist faction. They weren't yet called the Populares, but they were kind of the predecessor of it, since a lot of their members would later go on to be part of that, or at least some of their sons would. Obviously, Marius was the uncle of Julius Caesar, who was effectively the leader of the Populares in the 50s and beyond. Another thing to keep in mind is that while Lepidus, the consul of 78, had been a Sullan and is sometimes seen as a traitor to the cause, Brutus's support for him does not necessarily mean that he must have been a fellow Sullan who became disenchanted. He could have had a very different journey. So it's hard to make assumptions about Papa Brutus's politics. However, I think it's most likely that he was a Marian and that he had been more or less disbarred from public office because of his activity. He somehow dodged the prescription, whether he ran away or bought his way out is unclear. And then he sort of came out of hiding to aid Lepidus when Lepidus decided that the Sullan arrangement was not working. So that effectively is my thesis. I'm sorry I could not state that more succinctly, but this is a somewhat murky and complicated period, and I'm still learning more about the 70s in Rome, so this is my first real crack at this thorny subject. And the reason I chose to display RFK Jr. here is because I believe that his own policies are rather unclear. He's running for president at the moment, and a lot of what people think they know about him is based upon his family name. He is the son of Robert Kennedy, who ran for president in 1968, got assassinated, and the nephew of JFK. There are a lot of assumptions that go into this man from the minds of voters that may or may not correspond with 2023 reality. And I think we have to beware of a similar trend when looking at Papa Brutus and thinking about his politics. Inevitably, every discussion of Papa Brutus has to center around Lepidus's revolt of 78 to 77, in which Brutus played a major role. So let's talk about Marcus Aemilius Lepidus and the circumstances surrounding his revolt. In 78, Sulla had largely stepped away from public life. He was dying by this time. Whether he knew it or not is unclear, but certainly he was. And his heirs, or at least his close political allies, were trying to fill the void and keep the unity of the faction together. The two men elected as consuls were Quintus Lutatius Catulus and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and both of them, it was understood, would uphold what Sulla had created. And it appears that Sulla largely trusted both of them, despite some little snide comments we see in our sources that Sulla kind of knew that something was wrong with Lepidus all along. I seriously doubt that someone as ruthless as Sulla would have simply kept such feelings to himself and let things unfold. Peace between the two men was tenuous at best. They had very incompatible personalities. Lepidus was a kind of larger-than-life charismatic figure who also had some well-developed eccentricities. If you look at how he named his sons, his oldest son was named Aemilius Paulus after an extinct line of his family that had been famous during the Middle Republic. And then it was only his second son, the future triumvir, who took the name normally accorded to the eldest son, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. So he did a number of eccentric things, but he also was a very effective and popular politician. And Catulus was much more stiff and very old-fashioned and formal and frankly boring. And so part of the rivalry was this big difference in personality. And Catulus also, despite later becoming this great hero in the eyes of the Optimates, was someone who was not very popular during his time in office. We can see that because every time the two consuls had a dispute, Lepidus won. So Lepidus came out winning the vote, getting the applause, getting the bills passed, and Catulus was always on the losing side. So it's very clear that in terms of prestige, Lepidus was on a higher plane than his colleague. The thing that broke down their relationship fatally was a land crisis in Etruria. What had happened when Sulla had come home after the Civil War is that he had plenty of veterans who had fought against Mithridates, and he promised them land. By this point, the Roman army was professionalized. And so he ousted local farmers in Etruria who were non-citizens and settled his soldiers there. What he didn't anticipate is that the locals would not take that lying down. And so as soon as Sulla's body was room temperature, these farmers started to riot. They started to really rise up. And the two consuls were then sent out to deal with this problem together. And given that their relationship was just barely functional, the seeds of disaster were present. We won't delve too deep into the details of Lepidus's revolt here, as I'll save that for my video on Lepidus the Consul of 78. Suffice it to say for now that Lepidus found himself sympathetic to the plight of the dispossessed Etruscan farmers, whereas Catulus was not. Catulus was of the opinion that every little detail of the Sullan settlement had to be upheld with no compromises and no flexibility. Lepidus had a much more elastic view, I guess you could say, of how to best maintain the Sullan order. And this difference, combined with their earlier animosity, led to a complete breakdown in their relationship. Catulus engaged in pure obstructionism. Every proposal that Lepidus put forward, Catulus would shoot down. And Catulus also began calling him a traitor to Rome and a closeted Marian. So he began to really call Lepidus's patriotism and his loyalty to the faction into question. And Lepidus had fought pretty hard on the side of Sulla during the Civil War, so this was very much a matter of speaking fighting words in the Senate. Eventually, though, in time, Catulus not only had enough allies to engage in obstructionism, but he also was able to win over the majority of the Senate. And his accusation that stuck was that Lepidus had dictatorial ambitions. And what really made the Senate tip in that direction is that Lepidus was making more and more strident demands as his earlier demands were getting shot down. And some of those included things like restoring the power of the tribunes, which had been one of the key pieces of the Sullan reform, was to strip the tribunes of their veto power. So eventually what Lepidus was proposing was effectively just abolishing the Sullan reforms. But what really broke things down for most senators and made them adopt Catulus's view is that Lepidus requested a second consecutive term as consul. And the reason why this was the point of no return for many people in the Senate is because most of them hated Marius, and Marius's chief crime in their minds was serving back-to-back as consul about 5 or 6 times. I think he had 7 total consulships, and at least 5 of them were back-to-back-to-back-to-back-to-back. And the problem with doing that is not only that one person becomes far more powerful than all of his colleagues and more prestigious, but also it gums up the works and means that fewer men get to achieve their lifelong dream of becoming consul. And since the Roman Senate tended to regard itself as a boys' club by design, where if you have the right family name, you're entitled to a run at the top, this really rubbed them the wrong way, and they could really see the consequences of this screwing up their own and also their sons' ambitions. So this made things really fall apart. And Catulus and Pompey both took the field to fight Lepidus when he brought the farmers to Rome in person to make their demands. And it's unclear if he had armed his men already or if the side of Catulus were the first to arm. And remember, at this time Pompey is still rather young, he's still under 30, but he had been one of the stars of the Civil War, and he was seen as kind of the go-to guy among the Sullan faction for wars at this point. Pompey was still kind of idealistic, and he still thought that everybody actually liked him, whereas in fact they were still kind of secretly resentful that he had been Sulla's golden boy and that he had just been exempted from the curses of Norum. But here he would kind of prove his worth in the eyes of men like Catulus. As for how Brutus fits into all of this, we're not sure exactly how he came to be on Lepidus's side. He could have been a formally recognized legate who had been sent up to Cisalpine Gaul in order to help deal with the consequences of the Etruscan problem, or else he had been kicked out of office and booted from the Senate altogether due to his status as a praetor under the Marian regime, and so he might have come out of retirement effectively to try to rally the surviving Marians behind Lepidus and to get that revolt rolling. So we're not entirely sure where Brutus fits in terms of whether he was still in the Senate or not, but at any rate, he would join Lepidus and he would effectively be the second in command during the entirety of the revolt. It's possible that Lepidus had only intended to lead a protest march, but it turned into an actual armed revolt, and certainly the Senate saw it as an invasion. And so, as I mentioned, Catulus and Pompey raised forces, and Lepidus also armed his men, and the two forces squared off. Lepidus marched on Rome and tried to seize the city. It was defended by the consul Catulus, who won the battle and earned himself the name Capitolinus. From this point forward, Catulus would be the undisputed leader of the sort of post-Sullan faction that would become the Optimates, and he would become an icon for that faction, and hence in some of our sources. It's worth noting, however, that he was never really the first man in Rome, simply because there were plenty of people who absolutely hated him, and as I mentioned before, he really had no charisma to speak of. As for Lepidus, he fled to Sardinia, and there he died, most likely of disease. Sardinia was notorious as a place where people could become ill with things like malaria and die pretty quickly. His surviving followers went off to Spain in order to join Quintus Sertorius, who was also still in revolt against the Sullan general Metellus Pius. And so, this would further reinforce that narrative that Lepidus and all of his followers had just been Marians in disguise. again, I think that that is an oversimplification and that there's a lot more going on here, but that's a different topic that we'll get into later. Meanwhile, Brutus had raised the other force, and he had taken up residence at Mutina in Cisalpine Gaul. So he was having to face Pompey, the more capable of the two generals commanded by sent out by the Senate, and so his chances weren't good, especially since his chief had already been defeated. And one quick programming note, you'll notice that on the previous slide I had to use a coin of Lepidus the Triumvir, and now I'm having to use a map from 44 and 43 for this area. So this era of the 70s gets little to no love, and there aren't a lot of images that represent it. So if you are an aspiring map maker, might I recommend this period and the Revolt of Lepidus. While Lepidus was raising men in the field and the Sullan faction was gearing up to fight him, it came time for the consular elections for the next year. And Catulus, as the leader of the Sullans, seems to have really put a lot of thought into how the Senate should respond in a way that would keep the faction together and effectively try to paint Lepidus and Brutus as being defective individuals rather than as representatives of some greater cause. One candidate who was on the path to winning was Brutus's kinsman, Decimus Junius Brutus, who also was the father of one of Caesar's assassins. The other spot at the time looked like it was most likely going to fall to another candidate, but due to the intervention of Catulus, he stood aside to allow for one of the more minor candidates, who was a kinsman of Lepidus 78, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus Livianus, to win the election. And that has led Alison Rosenblit and other scholars to believe that Catulus's purpose in arranging for these two consuls to win was to show the entire Roman world that there was nothing wrong with either the Junius Brutus line or the Aemilius Lepidus line. It was just that there were two individuals who had in some way been corrupted or were defective and needed to be removed for the health of the body politic. And I find her argument here to be persuasive. That would make a lot of sense. It would create a cause that really may not have actually been present. It would have conferred a level of nobility, objectivity, and legitimacy to what was really just a really petty personal squabble between Catulus and Lepidus that really blew way out of proportion. And so this also explains why Marcus Junius Brutus' son would become such a renowned figure, and why Lepidus' two sons would both go on to have very successful careers. When it comes to the details of the short-lived siege of Mutina in 77, we know very little detail. For instance, we have no idea how big either force was, or if Papa Brutus really had enough time to lay in provisions to withstand a siege. It kind of seems like he probably did have enough time to lay in some provisions, but not enough for a siege of some epic length. We also don't know how things ended. Did Brutus strike a deal with Pompey and sort of betray his men in order to save his own skin? Or did he work in consultation with his men and they all wanted to end things on favorable terms? Or was he kind of forced by his men because they arrested him or simply walked out on him and left his city untenable? We really don't know. What we do know is that Brutus managed to hold out for long enough that it seemed like it was respectable now for him to give up. After all, his nearest allies were now in Spain, and they were not going to be marching to Italy to save him anytime soon. And so, this seemed like a good out for Papa Brutus, and for Pompey, it avoided the vagaries of an assault. Assaulting cities tended to be bloody business, and because there was no enemy force that might come to help, there was really no need to resort to desperate measures. Not to mention that the revolt had been contained and it wasn't going to spread. So Pompey, who normally acted rationally unless Metellus Scipio was effectively calling him a bitch if he didn't go out and fight a field battle, i.e. the Battle of Pharsalus, he normally made the rational choice and played it smart. Pompey also decided to grant Papa Brutus the dignity of a cavalry escort, so he was given a group of horsemen and sent to Regium Lepidi, which, as the name implies, was a settlement originally created by a member of the Aemilius Lepidus line, i.e. the same line that Brutus's close ally and political collaborator, the recently dead consul Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, hailed from. If my earlier assumption that Papa Brutus sided with the Marians in the 80s is correct, then he must have felt especially lucky when he learned that Pompey intended to send him into exile in a town where he would most likely be well received. Sure, it was probably a small, insubstantial, out-of-the-way place, but it was surely better than being dead. And, again, he couldn't really ask for better given that he had been on the losing side of what amounted to 2 civil wars in just a few years. However, luck was not actually on the side of Papa Brutus, and he would discover that 2K is indeed a fickle goddess, just as Polybius the historian said. A day or two later, before he could really fully unpack his bags and get the lay of the land in his new dwelling, there was a knock at the door, and Papa Brutus found that Geminius, one of Pompey's more unsavory associates, was there, and he put a knife in Papa Brutus, thus ending his life. There is a modern scholar who wrote a biography of Pompey that always defends his every action, who says that Pompey was justified in murdering Papa Brutus, and that in fact Brutus was trying to lead a kind of populist revolt by going to the people who were the beneficiaries of the Lepidi and getting them to revolt. However, the military revolt that Lepidus had tried had already come crashing down, and the subsidiary operation under Brutus had recently been defeated as well. There was really no gas for that to take off. There was no fuel for that. So that seems like a ridiculous excuse. And in fact, Pompey's allies in the Senate were also not impressed. And these are people who had been baying for the blood of Marians in disguise. And so for Brutus to come out of hiding as he did and rouse up some of the Marians who were still discontent with the Sullan victory, he probably was not a very beloved figure at that moment. Yet the Senate still very much questioned the judgment of Pompey. He never got punished for this, but then again he never did. However, it was little instances of ruthlessness like that that earned him the sobriquet the Boy Butcher, since he tended to kill all of his major political rivals. And it wasn't just the excess of youth, by the way, when we're talking about Pompey, because one video I plan to do in the sort of near future is on the Lucius Vedius affair, where this is in the 50s when Pompey was the chief man in Rome and Caesar was in Gaul. A man came forward in a kind of Jeffrey Epstein-esque fashion with information, and he was suddenly murdered before he could really say anything. And the obvious doer of the deed was Pompey. And there's another instance where when Sertorius was defeated, Pompey came into possession of Sertorius's correspondence, and then he read all of it to get all the information and see who Sertorius was in contact with, and then burned it, claiming that no one needed to know, except apparently, himself. So Pompey was a shady guy, is the moral of the story. But also, Papa Brutus was a victim of that shadiness. If you want to be a true historian, you really need to understand that primary sources are biased. If it's a contemporary source, it is someone who is writing with an eye toward persuasion. If it is a later source, they might just be talking about things going on in their own time, but using the past as a kind of example of what they see in their own era. And so one thing that I think is going on with our accounts of Papa Brutus and Lepidus, the Consul of 78, is that the politics of the late Republic, which were much better known, were being read back into the past. And there was a kind of desperation to make these relatively unknown figures from the past comport with what was known about their sons. But again, reality is far more complicated, and not all facts fit in with narratives. So for starters, I think that it's safe to dispense with the notion that Lepidus had been planning some sort of radical revolution. He was elected as a Sullan consul. And Brutus supported him. So if Brutus, Papa Brutus that is, was in fact in any way similar to his son, then that seems rather odd that he would back a radical popularis revolt. Of course, this should also free us from any illusions that Papa Brutus and his son were compatible politically, or that the circumstances they faced were in any way the same. Perhaps both of them wanted to be a second Lucius Junius Brutus, and both of them had very different interpretations as to what that meant in their own time. So, again, we have to be very careful about just accepting the way that things are presented without really considering the context. In terms of the more concrete legacy that Papa Brutus had, obviously he has a very famous son, but his death also made his wife a widow. So Servilia was now free to remarry, and as a more independent woman, she proved to be extremely adept at Roman politics. Much of Roman politics revolved around matchmaking, and she managed to set all three of her daughters up with powerful husbands. Remember, Junia Secunda married Lepidus, who would one day go on to be a triumvir, even though at first he was simply the second son of a failed rebel. And that's another thing to point out. There actually was a deeper and longer-lasting family connection between Brutus, the Consul of 78, and Papa Lepidus, Papa Brutus and Lepidus, the Consul of 78. I got that mixed up. And Servilia also famously was now free to pursue extramarital affairs, most famously with Gaius Julius Caesar. We should also understand that while it was very common for Roman politicians to inherit their father's political views, that was not a hard and fast rule. And in fact, there are very few hard and fast rules when it comes to how politics operated in the late Roman Republic. So whenever we look at this material, we need to be critical, and we also need to approach it with an open mind and understand that the unexpected is very much to be expected. So until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and everyone should hopefully enjoy their lives, and I don't really have an outro here, so I'm just going to end it right now.